Well, hello. Can you hear me all right at the back? Good. Well, where did we all come from? You'll see my T-shirt tells you we're 96.4% orangutan. The Sumatran Orangutan Society is one of several organisations helping to save the last habitat which supports elephants, rhinos, tigers, leopards, bears, monkeys and orangutans. And they oppose illegal developments and they rehabilitate traumatised orangutans. And then they release them later onto a safe island. Now I have homemade cards and poetry books on sale at the back for you to look at afterwards, and all proceeds will go to the orangutans. I'm very lucky to be here. I think we're all very lucky to be here. Welcome to the Museum of Chance. I'll take you on a guided tour. We'll dip into several rooms and see snapshots of the lives of extraordinary people. You'll see examples of the most basic way of living and of great human endeavour. We'll stop in one or two rooms a bit longer. The Darwin rooms are towards the end of the corridor. There's a lot to see, so the tour will take over an hour. As I said, I'm very lucky to be here. That's why it's the Museum of Chance. My father had two narrow escapes in his first 18 months. He was born in South Africa during the Boer War, and a mortar landed in the garden and smashed the windows, but the glass missed my father's pram. Life was getting too dangerous, so Dad's mother, Katie, took her mother and 4 children back to England. On the journey in the Atlantic, the ship rolled, and so did a baby on the deck. And only a flying rugby tackle from a crew member stopped my father falling into the waves. In the 1920s, he was in Mesopotamia fighting the Turks when a bullet whistled past his ear. So those were just 3 lucky escapes. And Dad's father, Archie, my grandfather, was lucky at least twice to survive the Navy. If any of those things had gone the other way, I wouldn't be here tonight. In fact, I wouldn't be here without many people who I'll introduce you to. So let's look at the first room. It's the most recent. Right, so we've got my father, Dad in the middle, and his first wife, Rosamond, on the left. She died in 1945. And my mother, Ruby, on the right. My brother, Robin, is from his first marriage, on the left, and my sister and I on the right. About 1960. This was taken by my mother. I'm on the left, and then Aunt Kay visiting from Hereford, Dad, my brother Robin and his wife Jennifer, and my sister with Kay's dog. I spent my early years in Greece, where Dad worked for the Foreign Office. He was away a lot, so Mum took me for many adventures on buses and boats to places like Voulos and Vouliagmeni, and I loved the lizards darting about and exploring rock pools. We lived in 4 outer suburbs of Athens, moving each year, including Glyfada before it was a resort. And Mum kept great photo albums. Angela was born in Greece just before we left. That's the Ford Consul, which I then learnt to drive when I was 20. But there I am up on the balcony, aged about 5. That's my mother and I on one of our trips. And that's Meteora, a stunning place. There's a monastery on top of the mountain, and priests used to be hauled up to it in a rope basket. We went on a donkey. I saw this place again 25 years later on my way home from Iraq, but that's another story. I had a bad year in 2007, losing my mother Ruby in January and my sister Angela in May, both from breast cancer. I miss them a lot. Their friendship, intelligence and kind nature and great sense of humour. Yeah, dear oh dear. That left one close relative, my brother Robin from Dad's first marriage, and his wife Jennifer. I'd never lived with him. He's 16 years older. His knees are painful now, so he can hardly walk, but this was his 80th birthday in 2012. Robin, Jennifer and my partner Prilly in Dymchurch. Robin worked on the Thames Barrier for the Greater London Council, and he got me my first summer holiday job when I was at school. Back from Greece, we moved into our house in southeast London in 1956. Angie became a nurse, I became a graphic designer, later an editor and environmentalist. Dad died in 1985. After Mum died, sorting the contents of the house took a while. I'd inherited from both families and looked for good homes for the things I couldn't keep. Inevitably, I've still got quite a bit. For me, the Museum of Chance is an emotional treasure house. It has a storeroom which gives a glimpse into some great lives. I discovered exciting people and stories Robin didn't know, although he had an idea of a Darwin connection. That's my mother feeding deer at Knoll Park in Kent, near Sevenoaks. My mother was a scholar and a linguist and studied archaeology of biblical lands. She collected pottery, and I found big books of pressed flowers labelled with their names that she brought back from Greece. She played hymns and gospel songs on piano accordion. She ran Sunday schools for which she created artwork and displays, and played piano for a girls' dancing class until she was 80. She wrote witty letters, but outlived most of her friends. I'm so pleased I taped her chatting about her family history. When inviting cousins to her funeral, I realised I was the only living person who knew how they were related. Mum's mother, Violet Collison, was the youngest of 10, and I'd met several descendants. I drew up the family tree. There was music. Mum's father, Bert, played a banjo in a glee club. Granny Vi's father, Will Collison, started a music shop in Woolwich and made and sold pianos. The last piano maker in the UK closed in 2009. How times have changed. So I'm lucky to have a Collison family piano. Will went to the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park in 1851, and I have a huge catalogue. My mother Ruby was an only child, born in 1916 during the war. She never knew her grandparents, you saw just now, who started the music shop. They died of flu the year she was born, within one day of each other. Now, this is Ruby with parents Bert and Vi at Herne Bay in 1928. I've still got that parasol, but the handle's broken. Bert was practical. He made me roller skates from pieces of aluminium. He'd lost 3 brothers in the First War and didn't talk about it, but was amusing and had a thirst for knowledge. Aged 70, he could still do a handstand. I wish I'd known him better, but I'd been in Greece 4 years and he died when I was 11. Mum told us of walking to work in the Blitz through the ruined London streets. Through hard work and language skills, she was at the Foreign Office, where she met my father. He'd been released in 1943 from prisoner of war camp in Austria. In 1944, Dad was appointed United Nations Chief of Mission to Albania to negotiate with dictator Enver Hoxha to bring supplies to starving people. He knew his wife Rosamond was ill, but she told him to go. In 1945, 3 weeks after arriving in Italy, he heard she died. So Robin was only 12 when he lost his mother, and had to stay with Dad's sisters. Devastated, Dad threw himself into his difficult work. Dad had taken Ruby with him, my mum, and she became displaced persons officer, and there she is. A stressful job, helping repatriate Greeks over the border in the mountains using lorries with snow chains, and finding no one to meet them, and watching heart in mouth as Italian mothers carrying babies and small children climbed rope ladders onto a big ship about to take them across from Albania to Italy. Mum's sense of humour shines through her wonderful photo albums. The Albanian on the left is called Col. The other two must be donkeys. After working on Mum's tree, I moved on to Dad's. I found beautiful photos, books, paintings, and exciting stories of my ancestors' lives. My father Darrell has a big room in the museum, which we'll leave for another time. But that's his book, An Englishman in Albania. It's out of print. But you can find some of it on the web. In the 1920s, Dad retired from the Indian Army after marching with Gurkhas up the Tigris in Mesopotamia to Mosul, a name you'll have heard a lot recently, to defeat first the Turks, then the Kurds. In 1977, not even knowing that Dad had been there, I got a job as graphic designer for Mosul University. Got married, drove through 8 countries, and spent a fascinating year in Iraq. Now, my own room at the museum has yet to be prepared, but I think I see a few pictures stacked against the wall, so let's just have a peek. I unknowingly retraced the steps of my father. Those snowy mountains are on the border of Turkey, seen from Iraq. He wrote to his sister Madeline from Zarko, a town right on the border, in February 1920. One night, the temperature went down to 8 degrees. The horses at least have a roof over them, but the poor mules get caked all over their faces and necks with snow, which freezes on them. These girls in Mosul are carrying kubus bread that tastes okay when freshly baked, but when cold it's like cardboard. Their dresses contrast with the bleached out colours you get for much of the day in Mosul. The best light is an hour before sunset. This was old Mosul from across the Tigris. I shudder to think how much is left now. I was invited to this building, built about 1900, high on the banks of the Tigris, by the museum curator there, a young man called Journaid, who'd inherited it from his father. It was used in the opening few minutes of the film The Exorcist. I don't know if it survived. The main road from Mosul to the Kurdish regional centre in Erbil. I love those folded mountains. Nemrud is 19 kilometres down the Tigris from Mosul. This is me, bearded at the time, dwarfed by one of the Assyrian winged bulls, 3,000 years old. Everything there has now been blown up. And you don't get sunsets like that very often. That's over the Tigris in Baghdad. I gave an evening of poetry and song with photos of Iraq, which is on YouTube. I can point you to. Right. Let's go into the next room. So this is my father, Dad with Rosamond. and his mother Katie, who brought the family back from South Africa. Rosamond died, as I said, in March 1945, and he married my mum in late 1946. So Dad was 50 when I was born. My sister was 7 years younger. My father's family jumps back in time more quickly than most. Many people of my age have grandparents who were born between, say, 1880 and 1920. Does anyone have a grandparent born earlier than 1880? No? One? Very good. 1862. Yeah. Okay. You've got a splendid history as well. Right. Well, my grandfather Archie was born in 1846, 170 years ago in the early Victorian era. Our great-grandfather Benjamin was born in 1809, the same year as Charles Darwin. When Archie retired from the Navy, he married Katie in South Africa in 1885. Her father Edwin had been in the diamond business, but Archie decided too many people were trying to make their fortune from diamonds. And that's Archie, aged about 22. He tried to farm ostriches and lost his money. But I still have a tin of ostrich feathers. When that shell landed in the garden during the siege of Kimberley, Katie, her children and her mother fled to England while Archie stayed in South Africa as a civil servant. Katie was a very able woman. She could play classical piano without music, and had her own composition published. She set up home in Bedford, where there was a good school, and brought up 5 children. That's Dad's sisters, Dots and Madeline, in a punt at Bedford. After the children left school, and Katie's mum died in 1913, she left Bedford. They lived in Waldeck Avenue. I don't know if any of you know Bedford. This is from a 1902 map. You won't find that road now. This was a German name, Waldeck. So in 1917, it was changed to Warwick Avenue. In Luton, they missed this, and we still have a Waldeck Road. Let's go into the next room. So this is Katie and Archie's family. My father was the youngest of 5. So we have Concy, Percy, Dots, and Madeline first. And as Archie was born in South Africa, as Archie stayed in South Africa when soon after my dad was born, Dad didn't actually see his father until he was 8. In 1906, Archie came home for a month, and he took the family on holiday in Malvern. So one evening he sang 2 songs, and his sister Connie, who probably took this photo, was in tears as she hadn't seen him for years either. The people in this photo are Madeline on the left, Dots next, Percy, Concy the oldest on the far right, and then my dad on front right, and that's Archie and Katie, their parents. After Bedford School, Percy went to work for 10 years in the customs office in Shanghai. Later he was a barrister offering legal aid in Rhodesia, where Concy joined him as a teacher. She'd lost the man of her life on the Lusitania, returning from New York when it was torpedoed by the Germans off Ireland in 1915. Percy saw me as a baby, briefly, but died the year I was born. I remember Dad taking me to Camberley to see the 3 white-haired aunts who never married. Concy, in her 70s, said, "Let's go into town," and set off jogging down the pavement. Archie had trained at the Royal Naval School at Portsmouth in 1860. Madeline, on the left, who you saw in the punt, was obviously good at steering. She was head of the Royal Naval School for girls from 1933 to 1960. It was at Twickenham until Bond in 1941, and she oversaw its transfer to Haslemere in Surrey. Here's Madeline with Lord Mountbatten at prize giving, and with the Queen Mother. In Malvern, Archie and family stayed in the house where Charles Darwin had brought his 10-year-old daughter Annie, hoping desperately that the waters there would save her life. They couldn't. She probably had TB. So that's Annie's grave in Malvern. A dear and good child, it reads. Archie retired and returned to England in 1912. When asked where the chiropodist was in Bedford, he replied, quick as a flash, there's the Bunyan Hall. It's probably close by. There's much discussion today as to whether education standards have improved or got worse. To train as a naval cadet in 1860, you had to be aged 13 or 14. My grandfather Archie enrolled aged 14 in 1860. These were the requirements. Write English correctly from dictation and in a legible hand. Read, translate, and parse an easy passage, either from a Latin or French author. Have a satisfactory knowledge of the leading facts of scripture and English history. Modern geography, insofar as relates to a knowledge of the principal countries, capitals, mountains, and rivers. To be able to point out the position of a place on a map when its latitude and longitude is given. Arithmetic, including proportion, and a fair knowledge of vulgar and decimal fractions. Algebra, including fractions, the first book of Euclid to proposition 32 inclusive. And if you're above the age of 14, in addition, you must have a knowledge of the use of the globes with correct definitions of latitude, longitude, azimuth, amplitude, and the other circles of the sphere, vulgar and decimal fractions, algebra including simple equations, the first book of Euclid, and a practical knowledge of the elements of plane trigonometry in its application to the numerical solution of easy and useful problems. And drawing will prove a most useful qualification for naval officers. So if the candidate succeeds in passing that exam, he's appointed to a training ship at Portsmouth or Devonport for the purpose of instruction, rigging of ships, seamanship, and the use of nautical instruments. And from June 1860 to September 1861, on board HMS Britannia, following all those exams, he conducted himself with diligence, sobriety, and attention to his studies. That's Archie. He had some exciting adventures in the Navy. Megaera is one of the Furies of Greek mythology. Her name means the jealous one, or one who holds a grudge. From the 1840s, wooden ships gave way to cheaper iron hulls. Less comfy, but they could carry more people and goods, and had more scrap value. HMS Megaera, 207 feet long, was one of the first, launched in May 1849. She had not enough storage space and used sails to conserve coal. In 1871, she was assigned to take Navy recruits to Australia to replace crew on other ships. She left England in February, was damaged in a heavy storm, and went to Ireland for repairs. Officers complained that the ship was carrying too much baggage and riding low in the water. In May 1871, Megaera left Simon's Bay, South Africa, en route to Australia, with 42 officers, including a sub-lieutenant called Archie, 44 Marines, 180 crew, and 67 recruits. In June, sailors found 17 inches of water in the hold. The old rust bucket had sprung a leak. Manning the pumps, sailors lowered the water to 13 inches and began to look for the leak. It took them 5 days to find, and it was a bad one. A rivet had come out. When engineers tried to fix a supporting plate, they found the ship's bottom in places was as thin as a sixpence, and to attempt to repair would have been fatal. A heavy Westerly was blowing with mountainous seas, and it seemed hopeless to try to get back to the Cape. In those south latitudes, the sea comes swinging around the world with no land to break it. One moment you're riding high, getting the full force of the gale. The next, you're down in the trough, only the upper yards on the mast visible. Megaera was 1,400 tons, but even a ship that size on these seas is only a fly on the wall. The saving grace is that these ships seldom broke. Captain Arthur Thrupp was in the Indian Ocean, halfway between Africa and Australia, in a slow, leaky ship, 3,000 miles to the nearest land. And that was only the tiny islands of St. Paul's or Amsterdam. On 15th June, he headed for St. Paul's. Every man, including officers, was bailing with anything and everything they could find to keep her afloat. After many anxious days, it was my grandfather, Archie Oakley-Hill, aged 24, who sighted the little dot of St. Paul's Island, saving the crew and passengers. The ship anchored in 14 fathoms, 70 feet of water, at the mouth of the lagoon. St. Paul is a half-submerged volcanic crater, a triangle with a big hole in the middle. The triangle is 2 by 3 by 4.5 miles, highest point 860 feet. They pumped out the water, but the anchor broke twice before they could make an inspection. Divers plugged the holes, but when they tried to put a supporting plate on the outside, the whole original plate gave way. She grounded between the shingle spits in 16 feet of water, ripping nearly the whole bottom out. 2 Frenchmen, who ran a supply station for whaling ships, were on the island with enough tea for themselves, and found they unexpectedly had 331 visitors. They could offer fresh water, as St. Paul had 3 ponds, which filled up when it rained, quite often. Fortunately, the crew were able to land 2/3 of the cargo, so they had food for all hands for a month. But there's very little water on the island. They had to break up parts of the ship to build huts. So here's a painting of the wrecked ship and the huts that were built. The floor was always warm, as the island was volcanic. Hot springs had a temperature of 175 degrees Fahrenheit. They collected rubbish once a day and dumped it in the ocean. They built a condenser to make 360 gallons of fresh water every day from seawater. Very clever stuff, that. Only one plant was edible, a sort of cabbage. Penguins tasted terrible. There were a few rabbits. Goats were hard to catch, so the main diet was fish and crayfish. Their boats were seaworthy, and outside the harbour there were ample fish such as Cape salmon. But they had to fend off giant albatrosses with 10-foot wingspan. One day they caught 700 pounds of fish. Another day they caught one fish weighing 811 pounds. One of the crew, an old cook, had been wrecked 5 times in 3 years. As they could be spending months there, food was rationed. Just as well, it was 4 months before they were rescued. They put up a tall flagpole to attract any passing ship. Several came in sight, but never close enough to see their distress signals. On July the 16th, the captain of a Dutch ship, Aurora, bound for Java, spotted the flagpole. He knew there were no trees on St. Paul and sailed closer. With one of their lifeboats, an officer was able to board, but before a rescue could be attempted, a gale sprang up and she was driven away. On August the 2nd, they reached Java with the officer and his boat's crew. The British consul sent telegrams to Hong Kong. The Oberon left for St. Paul to deliver supplies, and the P&O SS Malacca and HMS Rinaldo were sent to take them off. On August the 5th, a Dutch ship collected 5 sick men from the island. On August the 26th, the Oberon arrived with supplies and received a hero's welcome. On August the 29th, the Malacca and Rinaldo arrived in bad weather and almost became shipwrecks themselves. Rinaldo was bound for England and the Malacca for Australia. It took till September the 5th to get all the men and what cargo they could salvage aboard both ships. The Frenchmen were sorry to see them go. They found the British sailors and Marines more amusing than the companionship of penguins and rats. Beyond casualties, scalded when the boilers burst, when she was run ashore, there was no life lost. On Captain Thrupp's return to England aboard HMS Ronaldo, he was court-martialed, standard procedure when a captain lost his ship. After a lengthy investigation, he was honourably acquitted. This was one of the most famous shipwrecks in history, unusual in that most on board survived. In the entrance to the lagoon, the wreck of HMS Megaera lay visible for at least a decade. The following year, 1872, Archie and 3 colleagues spent a few weeks in the Solomon Islands, which included a very risky day amongst cannibals. But lucky for me, he lived to write up the story. At the end of that year, the following year, 1872, aged 26, but perhaps feeling older, Archie was justifiably promoted to first lieutenant. So let's go into Benjamin and Catherine's room now. So where did the Oakley-Hills begin? Well, Archie's father, Benjamin, my great-grandfather, was a key person in my history. In 1799, his father, Benjamin Hill, had married Sarah Oakley, known as Sally, starting a dynasty of Oakley-Hills. Sally was from a respected family in Wigmore, Herefordshire, near the Welsh border. Benjamin was her second son, and her parents lived until their 90s, but sadly, Sally died aged 39. Wonderful lichen, but I don't know if you can read that. Mrs. Sally Hill, younger daughter of MJ Oakley and wife of Benj Hill, that's right, of Ludlow, and died 21st May 1814 in the 39th year of her age. So that's Benjamin, my great-grandfather. He was born in Ludlow, and like his elder brother, John became a vicar. His first church was at Wardown Underwood in Bucks, and that's a painting of the church, which was probably painted by his wife Catherine, my great-grandmother. Aged 28, he became chaplain to Richard Temple, the first Duke of Buckingham. Temple died a year later, and at 29, in January 1839, Benjamin oversaw his funeral. Temple was fat and unpopular, but he was the grandson of Prime Minister George Grenville. So the body was received at the church door by the Reverend Benjamin Hill, the rector at Wotton. The service was performed in the most impressive manner by the Reverend Mr. Hill. And the Duke of Buckingham lived down the lane at Wotton Manor. Later owners were Sir John Gielgud and most recently Tony Blair. Anne, Duchess of Buckingham, presented Benjamin's wife, my great-grandmother Catherine, with a sewing bag with her embroidered monogram, CAH, 1841. Now, Benjamin's wife Catherine had very interesting ancestry, and that's a painting of her. She was born in 1817, and this is a letter she wrote in 1831 when she was 14 to the Gents magazine about the death of her father and uncle. That's her handwriting, my father and my uncle, who she lost aged 14. Her father, the Reverend John Theodore Archibald Reed, or JTA Reed as we know him, a Scot, was rector of Leckhampstead near Buckingham. And that's the rectory opposite the church in 1830. Sadly now a pile of bricks. But I think that painting was painted by the same person who painted Wotton Church, perhaps Catherine. J.T.A. Reid formed a collection of Bibles in almost every known tongue. He was one of the first to promote smallpox vaccine, saving thousands of lives by persuading people to be vaccinated. During a severe outbreak in 1804, he inoculated 1,000 people a month and continued to vaccinate for 25 years until his death in 1830. A list of 30,000 names. His 4-page pamphlet was translated into all European languages. That's the back page. And circulated by the governments of Russia and Prussia. All made vaccination compulsory, and smallpox became almost unknown. Catherine's uncle, the Reverend John Langham Darrell, was senior magistrate of the county, in which capacity he was impartial and humane, ever espousing the cause of the poor. He was for 52 years vicar at Stowe, and 50 years vicar of Lillingston Darrell. There's not much now at Lillingston Darrell, but it's important for our family. A painting by architect John Nash, 1752 to 1835, came down from John Langham Darrell to our family. And it was showing his new design for the drawing room at Stowe. My father's brother Percy was given the second name of Langham. Catherine's letter that I showed you just now shows a line from her mother to Maria Temple. Let me move to the family tree. There's Catherine, my great-grandmother. That was J.T.A. Reid, who did all this stuff on smallpox. And we go up here, Anne Langham, and her father was John Langham, who had married Maria Temple, and she was the daughter of Sir Richard Temple. So Sir Richard Temple is my great times 6 grandfather. He was the richest man in Britain, but sadly for me, 3 generations later, his fortune was squandered by a gambler. Sir Richard Temple's son, also Richard, inherited Stowe in 1697, aged 21. He became an MP and later Viscount Cobham. And his friends included author and politician Jonathan Swift and poet Alexander Pope. Now, if you think that's complicated, pay attention now. This goes off the tree. Sir Richard's daughter, Hester, married Richard Grenville, who became Prime Minister. Their son, George Grenville, also became Prime Minister. Their daughter, another Hester, married William Pitt, who became Prime Minister. Their son, William Pitt the Younger, also became Prime Minister. So in 2 generations, this family spawned 4 Prime Ministers, 2 Grenvilles and 2 Pitts. My father was given the name Darrell Reid Oakley-Hill, and his brother Percy's second name, as I said, was Langham. Sir Richard Temple's son, wrong device, who was Viscount Cobham, employed Capability Brown to design the gardens at Stowe, and walking around there is great fun. This is a stained glass window in the church, hidden by trees, where John Langham Darrell was vicar for 50 years. And you come across a series of delightful follies, such as the Temple of Worthies, which includes Alexander Pope just round the corner out of sight, and Shakespeare and Newton, quite a lot of people. You'll have heard of all of them anyway. And there's a Palladian bridge, which is very nice as well. Now, we've reached the first Darwin room. So here we have my father, Darrell, and then his father, Archibald, who had the naval adventures you've just heard about, my great-grandmother, Catherine Ann Reed, and she actually had more siblings, but I'm just focusing on 2. So we'll come back to George in a minute, George Veren Reed, remember that name, and we'll just have a quick look at Anna Maria Reed, who married Thomas Hussey. So Anna Maria Reed was a superb watercolour painter of mushrooms, and her sister Frances was rather good too. And 2 lavish volumes were published of their illustrations of British mycology, with 90 colour plates, mostly by Anna and a few by Frances, her younger sister, known in the family as Fanny. She might pop up later. I like that one because it looks to me rather like a little duck with boxing gloves. I liked her thinking as well. Anna Maria delighted in the mud and rot, searching for unusual and exotic fungi. She hoped her work would inspire future mushroom enthusiasts, especially young people, and that they would find an interest in nature and seek the charm in everything. She wrote both scientific and witty prose and sent specimens to leading mycologist Reverend Miles Barclay, and he named a genus of fungi after each sister. She married Reverend Thomas Hussey, who was the vicar at Hayes, Kent, and he was an astronomer. He was also a friend of Charles Darwin. That's the rectory at Hayes. And Charles visited there. At the back, Anna Maria would paint mushrooms, and Thomas watched the stars from his observatory. He's thought to have been the first to suggest the existence of the planet Neptune. He was declared bankrupt in 1853 and left with Anna to stay in Paris, where sadly she died, aged only 48. If you remember, just now you saw their brother, Anna and Catherine's brother, George Veren Reed. Well, he was the curate at Tinchwick in Bucks, where they grew up. He and Catherine grew up, and often accompanied his father on long journeys to perform vaccinations. After Thomas Hussey, in 1854, George became a popular rector at Hayes. And as you can see, he was there for 33 years, 1854 to 1887. And that is George Veren Reed, my great-grandmother's brother. Charles Darwin was looking for a tutor for his second son, George. And he liked George Reed. This worked so well, he also employed George to tutor his 3 younger sons, Francis, Leonard, and Horace. Examples of letters from Charles Darwin to George. 1859, George is top in the lessons tutored by Mr. Reed. The family will move to the seaside because of his daughter Henrietta's health. When they return, he will be glad to send Leonard twice a week, for tutoring. 1860, sends payment for Francis Darwin's tutoring, inquires about arrangements for Leonard, who is slow and not well, to attend with Francis. Asks whether he can have a cutting of Mr. Reed's carrion-smelling arum, which he needs for an experiment. 1864, Horace Darwin making progress, but tires easily and does not like drudgery. That's Charles Darwin's wife, Emma. A letter from Emma in 1887 to Mrs. Reed after her husband's death shows the Darwins' great respect for the Reverend George Reed. And all 4 boys became successful. All 4 were knighted and George and Francis became published scientists. So we've got, let's get my pointer out. So that's Charles Darwin and Emma. And then we have George, Francis, Leonard, and Horace. Well, that's actually in Downhouse, that big tree on a wall. In 1939, when my brother's wife Jennifer was 13, her school was evacuated to Cambridge, where she visited Sir Horace's house, the one on the far right. It was called the Orchards, and she remembers it as delightful and reminiscent of Downhouse. And she met Horace's widow, Lady Darwin. Sadly, the place was later sold and demolished. And there's Jennifer with my brother Robin at Darwin House in 2010. And that's me by the mulberry tree that Darwin planted. And that's Strelitzia in Darwin's greenhouse. That's I think, the national flower of the Canary Islands. And I've brought cards that I've made of that, if you're interested, at the end, because those will be any proceeds tonight will be, as I say, donated to help orangutans. When I took my brother to visit Hayes in 2015 and saw the drinking fountain dedicated to George Read, I noticed in the church a plaque to the Pitts, who lived nearby. And that's Pitt the Younger on a stamp. So, as I said, the Pitts and Grenvilles total 4 prime ministers in our family tree. I recommend a film made in 1942 that you can see online called The Young Mr. Pitt. It's great fun. I think Herbert Lom, famous for the Clouseau films, plays Napoleon. Right. One of George Verenne Read's 12 grandsons was this chap, Trelawney Darrell Read, born in 1886. It was painted by British artist Augustus John. Trelawney wrote 2 books about the Dark Ages, and in the 1930s was curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum. He might have enjoyed my Museum of Chance, because he also wrote a book about Shove Halfpenny. A miracle of games, combining demands on hand, eye and brain with a minimum of paraphernalia. The board should be of mahogany. The object of the game is to shove 3 halfpennies into each of the 9 beds before your opponent can do so. No easy matter. On reaching heaven, unless I find it already played there, I shall introduce it to the highest notice. A letter from Augustus John in 1942 refers to his portrait of Trelawney, a British archaeologist and neighbour, and says John's London studio was hit by a German landmine. A 1943 letter says that due to the blitzing of Buckingham Palace, he had to interrupt work on the portrait of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who you saw earlier with my dad's sister Madeline at the Royal Naval School. When Trelawney's local 12th century church in Dorset was restored, after timber was riddled with deathwatch beetle, he painted replica heraldic shields there. In 1907, aeroplanes were new, and farmers worried about them frightening their sheep. When, last week, early trippers went out to Bournemouth on Good Friday to gawk at army stunt flyers somersaulting in the clouds, some of the landed gentry sat down and penned letters to the Times in which they used the word sacrilege, underscoring it twice. Yet one took sterner measures, one Trelawney Darrell Read, 38, rich, retired and genteel. From a thicket, Mr. Read blazed up at one of the stunting airplanes with both barrels of his favourite grouse gun. The plane, flown by the squadron leader, soared on, but on landing he found many a lump of lead in its left wing. The first case known of a man being charged with attempting to murder an aviator while in flight occurred in England on April the 15th, when Mr. Trelawney Darrell Reid, a farmer, was arrested and accused of firing at a pilot with intent to kill and murder. "I desire," said country gentleman Reid, "to make a statement." "I wouldn't if I was you, sir," said the local magistrate. "Come now, I'll make your bail as easy as the law allows, £300. So now we'll move on to Benjamin Hill's great adventure. So my great-grandparents, Catherine Reid and Benjamin, married in 1841, then lived at Wootton Underwood, where you saw a painting of the rectory. They had 4 children, Benjamin, Annie, my grandfather Archibald, and Connie, who kept her mother's articles, pocket book with family births, marriages and deaths, her grandfather J.T.A. Reid's cowpox paper, etc. And Archie joined the Navy, as you know. Young Benjamin, on the left, converted to Catholicism, changed his name to Father Edmund, and became a missionary in America. Well, whence this wanderlust? Sadly, their mother, my great-grandmother Catherine, you saw the painting of, died of TB in January 1852, aged 34. This devastated the family, and I knew Benjamin had married again, but it was only when I looked in Connie's sturdy black metal box that I found the marriage certificate. It was in English and Spanish. Benjamin, a rural vicar, decided to take up the post of chaplain to the British consul on the other side of the world. He took his 4 children with him, Benjamin, 10, Annie, 7, my grandfather Archie, aged 6, and the youngest Connie, aged 3, with 2 of his wife's sisters, Etta and Frances, the fungi artist, as nannies. It was a perilous journey from Liverpool around the Horn of South America, where Darwin's ship, the Beagle, was nearly lost in a storm 20 years earlier. It was 8,750 miles, and through the Magellan Straits. It took 25 days. Once the 48-mile Panama Canal was opened, it cut 1,500 miles off the journey, 7,200 miles in 20 days. That's where they were headed. Valparaiso. So they came all the way down the Atlantic, through the Magellan Straits and up. Valparaiso means Paradise Valley. It was discovered by a Spanish captain in 1536, who named it after his hometown. Its golden age was the 19th century. In 1820, it became an open international harbour, large immigration of English, German, French, Italian and Spanish, a key Pacific port for ships bound to and from America. That ended with the 1906 earthquake and the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914. In 2003, it was declared a World Cultural Heritage Site by UNESCO. On August the 11th, 1852, a clipper named Grecian arrived from around the Horn with 330 passengers. 2 died en route, and 1 had fallen overboard. It docked in Valparaiso, Chile, land of earthquakes and volcanoes, and enterprise. And Benjamin and his family stepped onto a new continent. Soon after they arrived in Valparaiso, Benjamin's elder daughter Annie died aged 7. He lost a little Annie, as Darwin had. She'd been an invalid. They took a photo of Annie's grave, and then one of Connie, in case something happened to her. So that was an early process using glass slides. After 2 years, Benjamin married again. Arabella Garland was there with her brother. Her uncle, Horatio Bland, drew up the marriage settlement. He was a world traveller, and his collection, including marine fossils, was used to found Reading Museum. Benjamin, Arabella and family travelled home in 1856. So they were there 4 years. Arabella became Connie's mother. This is a popular photo in our family. So Connie is second left as Arabella pours from the teapot that came down to Connie's mother, Catherine. It was made in the late 1700s. There's my brother's wife, Jennifer, and that teapot with the Darrell crest still in use. And there's another photo of it. It's a very special teapot. While in Valparaiso, Benjamin became involved in someone else's adventure. I wondered why we had a large etching of Fairfax Moresby. He was the Royal Navy Vice Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific. The capital of Papua New Guinea is Port Moresby, named after him. In Benjamin's first year at Valparaiso, 1852, he met Moresby. He also twice met a chap called George Hun Nobbs, then aged 52. Nobbs had been in the British and Chilean navies. He'd been wounded in battle, briefly a prisoner, and in 1828, misprint, he had settled on Pitcairn Island in the South Pacific, then a land of pilgrimage, and became a teacher and tailor. Life had been hard under a dictator, but he was gone. Moresby visited Pitcairn and was a generous benefactor to the Mutiny on the Bounty survivors who were living there. As I said, there was a lack of food, drought and illness, but the islanders wanted an uninhabited island to go to retain their community. And Admiral Moresby recommended and funded Nobbs to oversee their relocation to Norfolk Island, north of New Zealand, bigger and with domestic animals. It had been a penal settlement, was a beautiful place though. Benjamin heard their stories, met Nobbs' son and daughter, who were educated in Valparaiso, and advised Nobbs on his ordination as priest and chaplain to the Pitcairn Islanders. In 1856, 67 years after Fletcher Christian and his fellow mutineers had sought refuge at Pitcairn, 194 people took a 5-week journey with much seasickness from Pitcairn to Norfolk Island. And I have a letter to Benjamin from George Hun Nobbs' daughter Jane in 1853 on her return to Pitcairn, thanking him and his family for their kindness, but also telling of a fatal accident. Her uncle was trying to use the old gun of the Bounty to fire a farewell salute to the boat that brought her home. I also have a letter from Moresby to Nobbs, written from Exmouth in 1854, copied to Benjamin, and a letter from Nobbs to Benjamin from Norfolk Island in 1857, saying that toward the base of the mountain there's plenty of timber, but hardly any running water. We have to rely on 3 or 4 deep wells. No rain has fallen for 4 months, and the island doesn't promise the fertility that we had expected from the glowing reports, but we hope to have yams and sweet potatoes in 6 months. There is great demand for wool, and whale ships will come for fresh beef and mutton. The Governor-General of New South Wales is to visit, and Norfolk Island is to be separated from Van Diemen's Land and appended to New South Wales. We send our love to Mrs. Hill, yourself and the dear children. Archie and Constance, I suppose, are at school. I should be glad to hear from yourself and dear good Miss Reed and Miss Fanny. Nobbs later married Sarah Christian, granddaughter of mutineer Fletcher Christian. Okay, Benjamin and Arabella back in Britain. So in 1860, Benjamin became vicar at Norton, a village on the Welsh border, where Arabella had 5 children in their house opposite the church. Percy, Nettie, Annie, Amy and Tom. In 1866, a vicarage was built and they moved in there. And I inherited this photo of the old church. It was enlarged to how it looks today in 1868. So this photo was actually taken before 1868. And here's how it's looked ever since. And the vicarage is behind on the lift. It was soon covered in ivy. The vicarage is now rated one of the best B&Bs in Wales. Victorian features have been carefully kept, like Benjamin's bookcase and the servant's bell. Norton was a beautiful place for children to grow up, with wonderful views of the Welsh hills. So this view is from over the stable block where Benjamin kept his horses. But of course, we were staying there, as a B&B a year or two ago. In 1929, after his time in India and Mesopotamia, my father was an editor for a London publisher when in came a man selling print. Joe Swire had written a book on Albania and said General Percy was recruiting 10 retired officers to run the Albanian police or gendarmerie for King Zog. This chance meeting changed my father's life. He was in Albania for 10 years, where he learnt the language and grew to love the country and its people's hospitality, despite their poverty. And the British did a great job of bringing order to a country still chaotic after 400 years of Ottoman rule. Dad visited remote gendarmerie posts across Albania's beautiful mountains on horseback, started an animal hospital and an AA motoring club, translated English football rules, refereed matches in the National League, became interpreter for King Zog, and stayed until Mussolini invaded in 1938. Contact with Albanians continued throughout his life, and this spread to the rest of the family. I still go to talks at the Albanian embassy, and I'm editing a book about a woman Dad knew in Albania. By strange coincidence, in the 1960s, 100 years after Benjamin, Joe Swire, who triggered Dad to go to Albania, moved to Norton, only 200 yards from this picture, down on the left, and lived opposite the church in the same house as my great-grandfather. Joe's daughter Pat is secretary of the Anglo-Albanian Association now, which Dad chaired in the 60s and 70s. So back to Benjamin and Arabella. I digress. We shouldn't have popped into that room at all, really. Arabella's first child, born in 1860 at Norton, was Percy Garland Hill. He was so intrigued by tales of Valparaiso that he went to live as a farmer in Chile. Not an easy life in the Andes, cold winters, droughts, earthquakes. One year, a flash flood washed away some of the land. He married, and these are his two sons. And he painted scenes of Chile. And here are Benjamin's 4 daughters. That's Connie on the right, the eldest, from his first marriage. Amy, seated. Annie on the left, and at the back, Nettie, who died aged 39. Some of my family history escaped, and I've been buying it back from YouTube. This morning, an album arrived belonging to my dad's sister Dots. And it contained this quote from Dickens, written in the album by her Aunt Annie, the one on the left. Trust in nothing but in Providence and your own efforts. Never separate the two. Have a heart that never hardens, or temper that never tires, a touch that never hurts. And that was written by Annie in 1909, written out in Dot's album. Dot's was her niece. Amy was another adventurer She's the seated one there. She enjoyed archery, and she visited her brother Benjamin in America and went to nursing college in California, later becoming head of Bath Nursing College. She also visited my father in Albania and painted this scene. Arabella's youngest, Tom, decided to be a sheep farmer. But he went to Australia. He wrote an account of a typhoon and of his solo 1,000-mile ride inland from Adelaide to the south coast. I wrote a song about this ride, which you can find on YouTube. His sister Annie, who wrote out that Dickens thing you saw just now, went out to stay with him for 2 years. And my brother remembers Amy, Annie and Tom when they were older. In 1874, despite pleas from the community, Benjamin left Norton to be the first occupier of the vicarage at Chaldon Herring, a lovely name, in Dorset, near where Arabella grew up. The church was painted, we think, by Connie or Amy. It looks the same now, but with big trees behind and more graves, including the one for Benjamin and Arabella. Benjamin's Bible is still in the church. He died in 1885. You can see on there it says 1879. He lived 2 years longer than Darwin. His achievements don't compare, but vicars were the centre of the community, and he was popular, respected, and led a useful, eventful life. I see we've reached the second Darwin room. Now, that's my dad. Can't resist bringing him in again. That's in the Indian Army in 1918 on leave at Quetta. A rare moment out of uniform. Now a very dangerous place on the Afghan-Pakistan border. In most photos, Dad looks rather serious. My brother Robin had never seen this one, so was extremely amused when I made it into a birthday card with a short note. What ho, old chap! Would like to let fly with some ripping yarns, but only time for the quick birthday salute and to pop this card into the post-horse saddlebag. Hope it reaches you with all good speed. Dad met Robin's mother, Rosamond, in India, and he married the brigadier's daughter. There they are in Albania in the early 30s. Rosamond was descended from Sir Richard Fletcher, a senior commander under the Duke of Wellington. That's a bust of Wellington at Walmer Castle in Kent. Fletcher fought in many wars, was twice wounded and collected a few medals. He died in 1813 fighting the French in northern Spain at the siege of San Sebastian, and there's a monument to him in Westminster Abbey. He was posthumously awarded the rare Wellington Medal, which came down to my brother. And that's it. And after a wow moment on the Antiques Roadshow in 2010, when these medals were estimated at £50,000, Robin donated them for safety to the Royal Engineers Museum. Rosamond's father was Dad's brigadier, Captain Gerard Arthur Fletcher Sanders. Here he is with his grandson, my brother Robin, who's very fond of that photo. Gerard and his dog are also together in the National Portrait Gallery. Robin's great-great-grandfather is William Darwin Fox. William married Harriet, the daughter of Sir Richard Fletcher. William Darwin Fox and Charles Darwin had a common grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. A wonderfully creative man who first came up with the idea of evolution. So did others. Alexander Humboldt greatly admired by Darwin. I went to the launch of Andrea Wolf's European best-selling biography about Humboldt a couple of years ago. And then there was Robert Chambers, who published his Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation in 1844 anonymously, fearing religious backlash. And Darwin's contemporary, Alfred Russel Wallace, whose fans include Sir David Attenborough and Bill Bailey. Wallace lived in Hertford, which is where that plaque is. (1823 to 1913). And there he is. He spent 7 years in Malaysia and Indonesia, writing the Malaysian archipelago. He, of course, saw orangutans in Borneo and Sumatra. He discovered the Wallace Line, a narrow sea channel east of Borneo and Bali, with totally different flora and fauna on each side. He was astonished. It separates Asia from Australasia, explained, we now know, by continental drift due to tectonic plates, first proposed in 1912 by Alfred Wegener. And Wallace's paper, after being in that area for a few years, propelled Darwin into finishing his long-held theory. Darwin, too, met an orangutan and was fascinated by her. She was called Jenny, and he paid her several visits at London Zoo. So you've got Robin, my father, and his first wife, Rosamond, his father, Gerald Sanders, who incidentally married Evelyn Bertha Kitchener, Robin's grandmother. She was a niece of Lord Kitchener. And Eliza Ann Fox was the mother of Gerald Sanders, and she was the daughter of William Darwin Fox, who married Harriet Fletcher, the daughter of Sir Richard Fletcher. So that's how we get there. William Darwin Fox, born in 1805, was Charles Darwin's cousin. He was 4 years older and a committed amateur naturalist. So this is Christ's College, which Darwin and Fox attended. That's me inside the gate with Darwin. And Fox was Charles's mentor at Cambridge, teaching him all about beetles and going on many expeditions, and introduced him to the inspirational Professor John Henslow, with whom Darwin spent so much time that the other dons called him the man who walks with Henslow. So William Darwin Fox and Charles remained lifelong friends and wrote each other over 100 letters, some to and from the Beagle during Charles's great adventure. Often Charles's letters would end with happy memories of their beetling expeditions. He wrote from Valparaiso, "You are one of the indirect causes of my coming on this voyage. You made me an entomologist and introduced me to Henslow. When Fox became ill, before dying in 1880, Charles wrote to Fox's son that he'd never known a kinder or better man." And that's Fox's descendant, my brother Robin, on the sandwalk at Down House, where Darwin relaxed and did much of his thinking. The big field that slopes away on a hill to this side of it is absolutely rich with wildflowers, and it has been put forward as a World Heritage Site, but it seems to be on hold. Nothing's happened on that yet. This is Charles Darwin as a young man. In 1835, the Beagle was in Chile. Charles felt an earthquake in Valdivia. The motion made him giddy. Two weeks later, sailing in the Beagle 200 miles north, he saw the result of the earthquake and tidal wave at Concepcion, which is 100 miles south of Valparaiso. He described it to Fox, a most awful spectacle of desolation. There is not one house standing. This was repeated in 2010, when coastal towns were devastated. One of Captain Fitzroy's tasks was to drop off the 3 natives they had taken from Tierra del Fuego, that's what it looks like in good weather, to introduce to the civilization of London. Back home, among their tribal groups, they reverted quickly to their previous existence. That's a map of Tierra del Fuego, so many islands. Another of Fitzroy's assignments was to map these hundreds of islands, so they were there quite a long time. And that is the Beagle Channel, just there. And that is the Beagle Channel. At Tierra del Fuego, the crew of the Beagle had a very narrow escape. A gale blew up, and they took shelter. But mountainous waves blew up with spray 200 feet high. 2 huge waves broke over the ship, so they cut away one of the whaleboats, and they knocked open the portholes to let the water out. If a 3rd wave had landed, the Beagle and its crew would have been lost. Many of Fitzroy's and Darwin's papers and specimens were ruined. But the Beagle is a prime exhibit in the Museum of Chance because it arrived safely home after its 5-year journey, and the world's understanding of science, geography, geology and natural history was vastly enriched. Top right it says Galapagos Islands surveyed by Captain Robert Fitzroy and the officers of HMS Beagle, 1835. So those are some Darwin stamps you may or may not have seen. And there's some more things that Darwin's known for. Darwin and the Beagle are still on our £10 note, but not for long. And you hear Fitzroy's name every day on the shipping forecast. And that's a map of the Beagle's voyage about which Robin's great-great-grandfather received letters. There have been some big people in my family. And that's me and a friend at the Natural History Museum. And that's the last 2 of our family at Darwin's residence, down house. Oh, is that the time? Well, that's the end of today's tour of the Oakley-Hill Museum of Chance, and I hope you've enjoyed climbing my family tree. And remember, I have handouts at the back if you want to donate to Orang-utans. Thank you very much.
Benjamin Hill married Sally Oakley in Whitmore in 1799. His son Benjamin set off a chain of adventure that came down to me as the last of the line. Born in Ludlow to Sarah in the same year as Charlie Darwin. He married Catherine from the wild Darrells and Reeds. Where does Charles come in? Well, that'll come later. Her Archie the sailor led to Rome.